Hello, this time on Sitrep.
We attacked their top command. We also got the chief intelligence officer and his deputy in Tehran.
They should not think they carried out an attack and that it's over. We will not allow them to walk away unscathed.
Where does the war between Israel and Iran go from here? And could we become part of it, whether we like it or not?
We've deployed jets to the region so that contingency support is in place for our armed forces.
I think it is a sensible precaution.
Israel has done a great job so far. It might need U.S. help, like with the bunker busters, perhaps.
We will respond strongly and we will stop aggression from any side, be it Israel or United States.
Of course I'm worried about escalation, which is why my focus is on de-escalation. I'm worried about escalation in the region.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
6 months ago, on our annual Sitrep Crystal Ball Look Ahead, the defence editor of The Economist, Shashank Joshi, told us, I quote, Iran has a number of choices to make. Do they seek nuclear weapons? Even without that, it's possible to imagine that Israel may decide to attack Iran's nuclear sites. Choices and decisions have been made now, Mike.
Yes. Go back to October the 7th, 2023, with the Hamas attack into Israel. And at the time, it became pretty clear that Iran didn't know about it in specific terms. It backed the idea of it, but that Iran was not party to the actual planning of that particular attack. And yet it was difficult for Iran, and it's put Iran on a downward slope ever since. The attack has begun a broader series of operations in the Middle East, with the Israelis now absolutely on the front foot. And I don't think anyone in Tehran could have imagined, awkward as it was for them after October the 7th, they couldn't have imagined it would have come to this, where the very regime itself is now fighting for its survival. That's how they must have to see it now. And it's a very strange turn of events. And the nuclear issue is only the issue that focuses the issue which is now really about the survival of the Islamic Revolution of 1979.
And what we want to do today is explain the potential paths ahead for this conflict, whether they bring it to an end or make it bigger, and what it all means for us. Well, to help us explain, we're joined by former UK National Security Advisor Lord Peter Ricketts. He's also a former ambassador to NATO and was a diplomat in Washington, D.C. Also with us is Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, who served 36 years in the RAF, including as Deputy Commander Operations. Welcome back to Sitrep, both of you. Good to see you today. I just wanted to start with a brief first look from each of you about the situation as we speak, almost exactly a week since Israel launched its first airstrikes against Iran. Greg, do you want to start?
Yeah, let me look at this from a purely military perspective. I mean, we the UK and America, for that matter, have been involved in the Middle East for decades, largely centered around Iraq, clearly, and also more recently Syria and the threats that have emanated from non-state actors. But I can tell you this for nothing, that for the last 30 years, any commander in that theatre has had one thought on their mind, and that is the threat of Iran. So the fact that this has now come to a head, quite frankly, is something that's been brewing and has been there for a very long time. And of course, there's an idea of painting who the good guy and the bad guy is. Nobody should go away here with the impression that Iran is the good guy, either through proxies or some of the actions they take around that region, not least of which recently the Houthis and against the international shipping. So Iran has been a military thorn in America's side and the Middle East side for a long, long time.
Well, this is the operation that Netanyahu's been itching to do for 20 years. He has seen the Iranian nuclear program as an existential threat to Israel. He has always been in favor of attacking it militarily. I think up till recently, he didn't think that Israel alone could do it. And he was held back by successive American presidents, including Donald Trump in his first term, who was all for trying to do a deal. I think the sequence of events that Mike talks about, the cascade from the attack on Hamas to suddenly the massive destructive attack on Hezbollah, convinced Netanyahu that he does have the power now to take on the Iranian regime. And it's extraordinary to me in military terms that they've achieved air superiority over Tehran so quickly. And so he's fully in it now, and he wants to go all the way through to the end. And he will go as long as he can, I think, as long as he thinks he has got the stock of defensive missiles to keep shooting Iranian missiles out of the sky. And of course, what he's been doing is trying to maneuver Trump into the position where Trump feels he's got no alternative but to back Israel by attacking Fordow with their bunker buster bombs. And clearly Trump is very close to that decision now. If he does take the decision to do that, that is a huge success for Netanyahu. In my view, it's a big threat to America and to Western assets in the region for reasons we can talk about.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little later. Well, let's try to understand what the UK is doing. It's moved Typhoon fighter jets and air-to-air refuelling planes to the Middle East for contingency support across the region. Mike, that's all the detail we've been given so far. Would it be safe to assume they've gone to Cyprus? Has any more detail come out unofficially?
Not that I know of. I mean, Greg would have a better sense than me, I guess, of it. But I mean, we know that we've sent Typhoons to Akrotiri. My understanding is that we had 2 flights of 4 there, and that another 6 have gone. So my guess is that we've now got 14 there instead of 8. But that's the best I know of it at the moment.
Yeah, I always try not to have too many secrets in case someone can get them out of me. That is by far the most likely option, and I think everyone needs to just put this in perspective, that this is prudent reinforcement of our assets in the region in case the conflict expands or widens. I think quite a few people have associated the tankers with the potential to use those with assisting Israel's attacks. Just so everyone knows, our tankers are not compatible with the Israeli combat aircraft. They use an American boom system. So we're not about to use our tankers to refuel Israeli aircraft. So yeah, I think this is a prudent reinforcement of a regime that clearly is a tinderbox. And of course, we have used Typhoons in the past to help defend Israel from attacks from Iran. So that remains an option downstream.
Hey, Greg, just on a matter of refuelling, could I just check with you? That my understanding is that our tankers can't refuel USAF aircraft because of the boom issue, but we can refuel, if we chose to, US naval aircraft because they use the soft hose that we do. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's true, Mike. So it's a strange situation, but the US Navy have chosen the same system that the Royal Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm use. So yes, they are probe equipped, but all the aircraft that Israel own are USAF type aircraft. So F-16s, F-15s, and F-35As. Yeah. So they're all boom aircraft. But yeah, we absolutely can help US Navy and carrier groups. So with carrier groups arriving in the area, obviously, then there is a link there potential, but that's again a long way down the track.
Yeah.
Peter, from your perspective as a former national security advisor, does it make sense moving these UK assets to the region, even in the context of the UK calling for de-escalation?
Yes, and I think the ministers have been clear that this is defensive. They are not contemplating taking part in the Israeli strikes on Iran, quite rightly in my view. But if this does widen, and we can perhaps come on to talk about the risk of that, then of course Britain has bases, Britain has military assets and others in the region that it will want to be able to defend. So I think rather than being caught short with the aircraft not in the right place, they've moved them forward. I don't read anything particular into that myself.
OK, so let us talk through then what the UK does have in the region, the capabilities and both what it could use, but what it might also need to defend, Mike.
Yeah, well, the fixed bases that we have, we've got Al Jaffa in Bahrain, which has got this new jetty now, which can take some pretty big ships alongside. And we normally keep some mine countermeasure vessels there. So the Middleton and the Chiddingfold is there. The Bangor is normally there, though I'm not sure if it's there at the moment. The Penzance has been there. So we normally keep a force of about 3 or maybe 4 sometimes mine countermeasure vessels there in Bahrain. And then we've got, obviously we use Al Udeid Air Base in Doha, which is really important. I mean, that's a big base. I think we normally have about 1,000 people or up to 1,000 people there. The Americans have about 10,000. but we have quite a lot of people there. We have had, of course, one of our Type 45s in the southern part of the Red Sea. It's been Duncan or Diamond as part of the anti-Houthi operation. I'm not sure if the Type 45s are there now. I know that the Dauntless went with the Prince of Wales group, which is now out of the area, sailing towards in the Indian Ocean now, and the Richmond was with that group as well. But they're sailing away from this particular trouble spot at present, as far as I understand it. And then we've got the personnel and people on Op Shada, and of course Equatorial. I mean, Cyprus is a big base for everything we do in the Middle East, and Op Shada is still ongoing with aircraft involved in that and personnel. So if I had to say, where are the places we'd look to defend, it would be certainly Equatorial, certainly Bahrain, Duqm in Oman as well. And some of the ships that we have in the area, and our, the presence that we maintain around the whole region. It's interesting when you look at how much, although we only have very small units, it's interesting just how many dots you can put on a map of the Middle East, which you say this is a British involvement. It's quite a lot of them.
And Greg, it is a slightly odd look that we have a floating air base with now 17 aircraft on board that only recently passed through the Red Sea. And yet so far, HMS Prince of Wales and its carrier strike group seem to be carrying on with their defence engagement tour rather than moving into place, as far as we know, for contingencies in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for the UK because that particular deployment was planned a long time ago and is predominantly based on a sort of engagement mission, if you like, in the Indo-Pacific. It's got deadlines to meet and various harbour visits to meet for good diplomatic and industrial relation reasons. So it's got a clock ticking that it's trying to meet a timetable to. It's been interesting timing because, of course, it came through the Red Sea just after the US had agreed a ceasefire with the Houthis, although we weren't sure who was included in the ceasefire. So we squeezed through there in a bit of a gap. And we just left Duqm in the area around Oman, having replenished on its way around past India. So I don't see it coming back, quite frankly. I mean, the great thing about it is it obviously can do that. It's flexible enough that it can turn back as required. But the UK is not seriously considering the sort of strike options that capability brings. And right now, putting more ships into the Persian Gulf is probably not the place to be right now.
Well, let's try and understand a bit more about the UK's thinking right now. Peter, you've been in the room for many COBRA meeting of the kind Keir Starmer chaired on Wednesday. What's going to be going on behind the scenes right now?
Well, a number of things, I guess. First of all is the strategy of keeping as close to the Americans as we can while not being involved in their action. Keir Starmer was up on that tightrope at the G7 meeting in Canada, managed to sit down and have some quite useful discussions with Trump, it seems. But then Trump, as soon as he got out of there into his plane, he was immediately starting to threaten Iran with American attacks. So I think there's trying to second guess what the Americans might do, what assets they might ask of the UK in relation to a strike, and we've all seen in the press the possibility they might ask for access, particularly to Diego Garcia, for their B-2 bombers if they were going to undertake some kind of bunker buster strike on the Fordow installation. And then I'm sure there will be contingency planning about what if the Americans do that and the Iranians start to lash out. Would they lash out only at American assets in the region? Might they regard the Brits as in the same basket as the Americans, and therefore the sort of American British bases that Mike's been talking about, or British embassies or communities, could they be vulnerable to asymmetric type terrorist type attacks? I'm sure British communities in the region, their safety and the safety of British military and other assets in the region would be very much part of the agenda. There's the issue potentially of evacuation of civilians from Israel. I think British embassy families have been withdrawn as a precaution, and I think the travel advice is now very much not to go to Israel. But if it got to the point of having to evacuate, well, then that would be another contingency plan to activate.
And Peter, in Whitehall, who is talking to who? Where does the MOD sit in the chain? Well,
in the NSC, absolutely, for a start. I actually bumped into the Defence Secretary in the embassy in Paris yesterday, so I know the Defence Secretary's been in Paris talking to Mr. Lecornu, but there will be tight coordination going on all the time at official level, and then clearly Keir Starmer is calling the NSC together when he needs to. So I think Whitehall is used to this kind of crisis planning, and we've got the machinery for it.
Curious to hear you just bumped into the Defence Secretary just like that in Paris. So did you have anything to say to him? Can you enlighten us on your conversation at all?
Something like, "Hi, Defence Secretary, how are you doing?" He was rushing in, I was rushing out. But he'd come over for a bilateral with Lecornu, and we'd both been on a delayed train. No, very, very rapid. But it shows that, we're in touch every day at ministerial level as well as official with our key allies. And while we're talking to Americans, we're also, of course, talking a lot to the French and no doubt the Germans, and I hope also to the Saudis and other Gulf Arabs who could have a very important part to play when it gets to a phase of winding down from the fighting, which it will at some point.
Yeah, I was going to say, nothing to do with the big air show in Paris, perhaps.
Couldn't possibly comment.
Mike, did the MOD have a plan for this sat on the shelf, do you think?
Not necessarily, but I think, as Peter said, it's all dealt with in the National Security Council because they're coordinating all the time. The way the system is kind of shaken down, I'm not sure it was intended this way, but the NSC does this all the time, and COBRA meets in a crisis. So COBRA does crisis coordination when things are very tight or the deadlines are tight, and that's entirely reasonable. I think the mistake that the government often makes is announcing that COBRA is meeting and the Prime Minister is chairing COBRA as if it gives extra political importance to what is actually just a sensible process of coordination under pressure. And I heard a couple of programmes last night. One of them was on Sky, where a commentator was saying how ridiculous that Britain should have a COBRA meeting, the Prime Minister should chair COBRA, as if somehow we were important in this crisis. And I think you completely misunderstand what COBRA is there to do. Any organisation should sensibly think through the options, think through the what if issues, and decide, have we got everything in place if we need it, or what else do we need to put in place? But I think it is a fair point in a way that when Downing Street announces to the press the Prime Minister will chair a COBRA meeting, it actually makes it look more extraordinary than it ought to be, and it can look like political grandstanding when it should be a matter of normal bureaucratic coordination.
I just give you a bit of reassurance here, Kate. I mean, I've been involved in this for longer than I care to remember, and was also in PGHQ for many years. The UK has some pretty sophisticated contingency plans for the things that are quite likely to happen. This is one of those things. We always knew that Iran was a tinderbox. What we didn't know is whether Iran would start something, Israel would start something, or the US would choose to preemptively strike. There would have been contingency options around all of those. The problem is, of course, they never quite turn out how you envisage them. So you clearly have to then react to the politics of the day and the situation on the ground. And I think what's really changed here is the fact that it was Israel, but that was always known as a risk, and therefore what would be the defensive posture of everyone else in the region. But I think what's really caught everybody off guard is the speed at which Israel has achieved what I would call, and I think Mike would share the same thing, air supremacy. I mean, Israel is now wandering around at will, targeting whatever it wants, stand fast things that are too deep underground to reach. And I think that has caught everybody off guard, the pace and the speed at which Iran has become so vulnerable.
Peter, will there be red lines being set that if another country crosses one of those red lines, then we do get involved?
I don't know. I suspect not. No, I think they will try and keep tactical flexibility. Keir Starmer's given a pretty clear overall indication that he wants to see de-escalation rather than escalation. So I think it will be a question really of what support the Americans might call on us for and what we might be able to give. Just on COBRA, I mean, which I used to chair pretty regularly, National Security Advisor, the point really is that the National Security Council should be the strategic level where the Prime Minister has his top advisors, meets occasionally, sets the strategy, and COBRA is the sort of tactical crisis management center where you meet 24 hours a day if you need to in a hot crisis with all the departments represented around the table, and then ministers can come in and chair a session occasionally to see how the crisis is going. So COBRA is for crisis management, and yes, it tends to be a way for the political level to reassure the public that ministers have got a grip on whatever crisis it is, that they're directing things. And it sounds more dramatic than it is, because what it stands for is Cabinet Office Briefing Room A, which is a classic sort of Whitehall piece of bureaucracy. But it doesn't necessarily have to be dramatic. The National Security Council is the place where the really difficult decisions need to be taken.
And what about the red lines for our involvement if it does happen, if the UK does get involved, Peter?
Well, I mean, I guess red lines for us are the safety and security of our communities around the region, our embassies, our military bases. We would want to do everything possible to protect those, and to whatever extent we can, the civilians who are coming under fire. I think that those would be the kind of political red lines. I think there's a political need as well in the hot crisis to also be thinking about how this ends and what role Britain, Saudi Arabia, France and others can play in winding this down and getting back to some kind of way of living together with a very bruised, angry, probably defiant Iran in the future, and preventing another rush towards nuclear weapons. So I think there are sort of red lines of the safety of our assets and people, but also a bit of constructive diplomacy, thinking, what follows these intense exchanges of fire.
Which is also why, isn't it, Peter, that we hear that now that Britain, Germany, and France are trying to get together in a way to what is left of the old JCPOA, which has been staggering along, may nevertheless, what's left of it may still provide an avenue for getting back to some sort of negotiated discussion, if not a settlement about this, and that the Iranians may be prepared to come back into a sort of a JCPOA framework, at least to talk about a future that offers them a choice between complete surrender and destruction of their regime.
Yes, and the irony of all this is that the sort of deal that Trump and his envoy Steve Witkoff seemed to be getting towards was something that was quite like the JCPOA, the deal that Trump pulled out of in his first administration. And the benefit for that for Iran is that it allows them to have a civil nuclear program, but not a military nuclear program, and keeps anything to do with enrichment under international supervision. And looking back, it was not a bad deal at all, really, until Trump pulled out. So yes, I think it's entirely right that those who aren't directly involved in this crisis, like the Europeans, should be thinking next stage, how do we get an Iran that will be feeling surely, pretty chastened and perhaps in a mood to think again about its own future, not immediately, but over time.
Greg, considering all the variables that we're facing at the moment, from your experience, how would military personnel be involved in the discussions so the political decision makers know what options they've got?
Yeah, it's as simple as that. It's giving choices and the pros and cons from a military perspective of what those choices might be, what the risks could be, and you end up talking about potential casualties, who is protected, who isn't, what that might mean in the event of certain attacks based on the best intelligence that you've got. And then it's up to the politicians then to make the political choice. So it is just about giving effectively a series of options that they can then choose from.
Right. In the big scheme of things, the most consequential decisions right now lie with the US and President Donald Trump. He said he doesn't just want a ceasefire, he wants an end to the war. But then there's what he told reporters when asked directly on Wednesday whether he would strike Iranian nuclear sites.
I may do it, I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble.
Mike, does even Trump know what his plan is?
Probably not. He will have to make a decision quite soon, though. He can't let this run for another week or 2 weeks. We're looking at a decision probably in the next 48, 72 hours. But I'm sure what he's weighing up is not just the strategic issue about Iran and the US role in Iran, but also his own base in the United States, since the MAGA Republican base appears to be deeply split and actually very abusively split. The way they're insulting each other, even within the MAGA movement, is quite astonishing because this may be seen as a complete betrayal of his America First idea that he won't get involved in foreign wars. But let's be realistic. I mean, in his first term, he was involved in the strike on Syria. In this term, he was presided over a prolonged campaign against the Houthis only a couple of months ago. A lot of airstrikes, into the hundreds in total. And so it's not that he's against using the military to strike. And he would like, I'm sure, to be identified with success. And if this Israeli operation is going to be militarily successful, the United States will certainly identify itself with that. But I think his hesitation, I'm sure, is more to do with the domestic implications than the actual international implications of as we're finishing off the Israeli operation.
And Greg, part of the reason there is so much focus on the US is because of the bunker busting bombs that only they have. Can you just explain to us what they can do and how?
Yeah, well, there's some debate about what they're actually capable of doing. There's some serious physics and mathematics involved here, and you need to know quite a few things, like the rock that a mountain is made out of, and how much concrete has been poured to create whatever underground system you've got there in Iran. So the GBU-57, the MOP, I forget what it is, the maximum ordnance penetrator, or some such a phrase, typical American
massive ordnance penetrator.
Massive, of course it is.
There we go. Glad we cleared that one.
Massive, wouldn't it? They are designed, and the spec that's given is something around 200 feet, 60 meters. There is a lot of stuff on social media questioning whether that's valid against hard rock or whether that's just soft earth. So there is a doubt here as to whether even using those weapons, which nobody else has, are even good enough to achieve the aim here, which is to get inside the underground facility and basically vaporize it, and try and kill off any capability or any lasting vestige of fissile material. So that is the prime asset here that America has to offer Israel, and I think that's the debate here, because America could do a number of things. It could assist Israel, providing air-to-air refueling, extra gas, more weapons, etc. And it probably is providing some of that already through the weapons program. It could do these limited strikes and try and convince Iran that it's just a light touch, that we're not really getting fully involved, or it goes all in and joins in with Israel. So I think that's the debate that's probably happening within America. Those are the three options that are probably being presented to the president. And I think this doubt over whether the B2 option and the GBU-57 is able to do what it can do will be weighing on their mind. I think there's one important factor here, because I know that Diego Garcia often gets brought up. It's clearly a hugely topical political hot potato in the UK, that the B2 is more than capable of doing this all the way from the continental US. It doesn't need to stop anywhere.
Yes.
So, you will get a few minutes notice of this happening. In fact, Iran will get no minutes notice. So the idea that this could be done through a long, slow build up in Diego Garcia or anywhere else for that matter, yes, it could happen that way, but it could also happen overnight with a direct flight from the US.
And to that point, Peter, what do you think the conversations between London and Washington are sounding like right now?
Well, first of all, I think, as Mike said, there are two Trumps jostling in his head. There's the Trump close to his base who doesn't start wars, who does deals, and there's the kind of Republican strongman who certainly doesn't want to be out tough guyed by Netanyahu. And if he can come in at the last moment with a coup de grace to finish the job with a surgical American strike as he would present it, he might well be tempted by that, and the mood music seems to be shifting in that direction to my mind. But the question is, would that finish the job? Would it finish the job in terms of destruction of nuclear capability? Would it finish the job in terms of being a quick in and out by the Americans? All of us have got experience that it's very easy to start these things, but then once you've started them, they're out of your control. And it wouldn't just depend on what the Americans did, whether this was over. It would depend on what the Iranians did and whether the Iranians would try and get back at the Americans in some way or other. My feeling is they would, perhaps not immediately while they're under the cosh, but over time, they've got all kinds of capacities to strike at American targets in the months and years to come. And Trump has to weigh that as well, because in that way, he could find himself sucked into a more direct American war with Iran. I don't know whether he is taking that seriously, but all experience shows that you can't count on just coming in and out quickly with a single surgical strike on what is, after all, a massive strategic asset for Iran. It wouldn't be light touch, Greg. This would be attacking something they've spent billions and billions of dollars, of which they don't have many, building. And so to destroy it would be, for them, a huge strategic defiance, and they would feel something had to be done to get back at the Americans, I think.
Let's just consider another scenario, Mike. If Iran were to strike at the US somehow, whether preemptively or in response to US military action, does this become a NATO Article 5 matter that means we have to get involved?
No, because NATO Article 5 is only regarded as applying to Europe. The only ambiguity would be, of course, that we interpret Europe as the Mediterranean as well. But certainly in the Middle East, you would say that an attack on a NATO ally in the Middle East is not an attack on the homeland of an ally. It's not an attack on the sovereign integrity of an ally. And so the only ambiguity I would see would be if an attack took place somehow in the Mediterranean. But I don't think that's very likely in present circumstances. Stand aside the possibility of Akrotiri being vulnerable, but that again is not the sovereign. It is sovereign territory of the United Kingdom as a sovereign base. But I don't think Article 5 would be invoked if Akrotiri were attacked. I mean, Peter may correct me on that. I don't think it would be.
No, well, just to slightly amend your drafting, Mike. I mean, the NATO treaty talks about treaty of NATO, the territory of NATO members in Europe and North America. Remember, the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked is when America was attacked on 9/11. So yes, I mean, there is a clear territorial definition of where Article 5 applies, and that would not be in Iran or indeed in US assets in the Gulf. I mean, territory. I mean, yes, British sovereign territory in Cyprus, I suppose, conceivably would be, but it would be a pretty odd scenario because Cyprus itself is not a member of NATO. So I don't think we're talking about NATO here. I think we're talking about kind of coalition of allies responding, if necessary, to Iranian attacks. But principally, it has to be an American worry. If America attacks Iran, then they have to now, for years, take extra precautions against the possibility of terrorist or other asymmetric attacks by Iran against American assets.
Greg, from the UK point of view, if we were drawn into some kind of escalation, a coalition, what could we do? What's our most likely contribution to a coalition?
Yeah, we kind of almost need to step back on this because the first thing is a lot of those American bases and facilities, there will be Brits on them. So an attack on what is primarily an American asset could theoretically risk Brits living there. Now, some of those bases have got hardened facilities. Some of them have got air defense systems surrounding them. But as we've seen in Israel, even the mighty Iron Dome is not infallible. So there is every chance that things could get through. The challenge for the UK is we don't have assets that we could put in place, or not many of them that we could put in place to defend against some of those. So the first problem we're going to have is how do we protect the force? Does that mean dispersing it? And I think in terms of the shipping that Michael was talking about earlier, I gather from the satellite imagery that those ships have already started dispersing, and i.e. they're not going to be fixed in a location that they're normally seen in. So the trick here actually is to protect the force first and foremost. That could even mean bringing it out, because sometimes that might be the only option. In terms of what I think you're getting at is what could we do proactively to join the mission as it stands? Well, there are carrier groups converging on the region. As Mike said, they are desperate for gas. They do need air-to-air refueling. And the USAF don't provide as much, or it's not as easy to provide off a USAF tanker than it is off a Brit tanker. So the US Navy rather like Brit tankers. But of course, to put the tankers in theatre, you then put them at risk. So there's no action here without a subsequent consequence. Should we be in a defensive posture with the aircraft, then we could use Typhoons in an air defense role. There is really no air threat now from Iran. That's pretty much been eliminated. So we're only talking about shooting down drones, cruise missiles. Ballistic missiles, however, are a whole different challenge. Only the Type 45 ship has a capability against that, and we have few and far between of those. And we could, of course, conduct strikes, but I think we're a long, long way from the UK considering that type of a scenario.
There is, of course, the possibility that this war will remain between Israel and Iran. Mike, let's just look at the balance of power here. Israel claims air superiority. It took out a big chunk of Iran's air defences, as we've already said. From inside Iran, though, even before the strike started, militarily, is everything stacked in Israel's favour right now?
Yes, pretty well. I mean, we're looking at the number of missiles that Iran was thought to have. I mean, the figure that was generally touted was 3,000. I think my information is it was much nearer to 2,000. The Israelis said that the Iranians had used up over 350 of their available missiles in the first 4 days. So if we think that, 4 days worth is 350 out of a total of 2,000, then there's only so many days that the Iranians would be able to continue with. that. More importantly, they're losing launchers. And again, the Israelis claim that they have destroyed about a third of Iran's launchers. And if that's the case, then that's a serious problem for the Iranians, because even though these launchers are mobile, the Israelis have got so much visibility now of what's going on the ground. As soon as they can see a launcher, they've got a very good chance of destroying it. So I would expect the Iranians to lose even more of their launchers in the coming days. And although some of their missiles are getting through, about 10% of their missiles and drones are getting through in Israel, and there was a big strike last night on the hospital. Nevertheless, at 10%, it's 10% of a diminishing number. And so undoubtedly the Iranians can still keep hurting Israel. And because their missiles are not so accurate, they are, and they're being distracted as well. They are hitting residential areas and they're doing more civilian damage. Whereas the Israelis are in a position to just steadily dismantle the most of the nuclear infrastructure, the military infrastructure, and the governmental infrastructure. Now, whether they can kill off the whole nuclear program is very doubtful, but they can certainly damage it on their own. But they can almost certainly dismantle the military machinery that has supported the government, and they can just do that methodically over the next 3 or 4 weeks, with or without the Americans. The question is, this will end in a way, as these things always end. We always say that the one power declares victory and leaves. And in this case, the Israelis will declare victory and stop. And then we'll sort of consider where that leaves us, where that leaves the Islamic Republic and so on. But that's it. They'll just keep on dismantling facilities in Iran as things stand, and then they'll declare victory and stop.
Greg, do you have any sense of how long Iran can keep up the strikes that we've seen so far, and Israel too?
Yeah, Iran's got a calculation to make here. It's not dissimilar to the one sort of that is slightly done in between Ukraine and Russia. Is you can't use your entire war stock on one fight if you hope to be able to defend yourself from what comes next. And if Iran considers itself able to survive this onslaught, how many missiles does it need to keep back to maintain a credible threat so that nothing else happens in the future? And of course, we shouldn't underestimate, they've been providing the Houthis with missiles, Russia with missiles. And I'm sure that Israel is doing as much as it can to take out some of the factories, some of the facilities that can continue the production of these. My understanding is Israel have pushed most of the Iranian weapons out of the western half of Iran. So Iran are now struggling to reach Israel with some of their weapons because they're too far away. So Israel is slowly but surely putting them in a box here. And Iran eventually may have to sue for peace, because if it just runs out of weapon stocks, quite frankly, it no longer has a regime to protect.
Peter, a final thought from you. How much is at stake here if this goes wrong? And given where we are now, what would the best outcome be?
Well, I mean, there is great scope for this to go wrong, as you say. I mean, it has been contained so far. But an Iran which reaches the kind of stage that Greg is talking about, where it has no more options to attack Israel, could well be tempted to go for broke with some much more dramatic escalatory option. Closing the Straits of Hormuz, attacking oil facilities across the Gulf. I mean, it would be self-inflicted wound, but it would also dramatically seize the attention of the world, spike the world oil price, and perhaps pile pressure on Israel to get its operation over. So, I mean, it could spread. That I think is the really bad scenario. The better scenario is that Iran now decides that this whole thing has been, he's been seriously miscalculated, that they should get back to the negotiating table, that they should send some sort of feelers to Trump to say, okay, we are now ready to get back to serious negotiations if the Israelis stop, and try and re-engage Trump in the deal-making mode with help from the Saudis and the Europeans. That is probably in this circumstance the best scenario.
And Mike, this time next week, you and I should be talking about the NATO summit, which should be focused on Ukraine and our security in Europe. How much more difficult is it going to be to make progress on that amid all this?
Yes, I mean, short term, the news is all bad because of this, because it's difficult enough to keep President Trump in the room for a multilateral summit. I mean, he hates them, he's not very good at them, and he finds ways to wreck them if he can't control them. And so keeping him in the room, as it were, for a 2-day summit will be challenging. And there's enough to divide the United States and the European allies already on the table without the fallout from this crisis, because undoubtedly the United States does take a differently nuanced view, let's say, to the Europeans. So it's another thing that we will have to try to manage and try to keep him in the room for. And then in the short term, this is all good for Russia. It pushes the price of oil up, which will help Russia's economy. It distracts attention from Ukraine. It gives the Russians some leverage to claim that they can have some influence with the Iranians, and gives Trump another reason to give a free pass to Putin on so many other things, because he now feels that there is something more specific to this partnership. So in the short term, all of this is bad for us. In the longer term, this may actually turn out to be quite bad for Russia. The Russians have already lost one major client in Syria, in Assad's Syria. They may be about to lose another major client in Iran. And the balance of forces in the Middle East may be changing in ways that are not particularly good for the West, but are certainly not very good for Russia either. And so in the way of politics, the way things, what goes around comes around, this may not be so much to Russia's advantage. But in the short term, you have to say President Putin is yet again a very lucky boy.
We shall leave this conversation for this time. There'll be plenty more to talk about next week, I am sure. Thank you, Mike. Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, thank you as well. And Lord Peter Ricketts, it's been great talking to you all. That is all for now. But as I say, Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday on the last day of that NATO summit in The Hague. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news and our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.